Imagine a world lit by firelight and fear, a world where the veil between the sacred and the profane was thin, almost transparent. A world where your body, your desires, your most intimate acts were not entirely your own. They were battlegrounds for salvation and sin, canvases upon which society, the church, and even the stars, it was believed, painted their decrees. Tonight, we don't just tiptoe around the edges of this world. We step directly into its most private chambers, into the haylofts and the stone castles, under the rough spun sheets and the silken canopies, to ask a question that echoes with a forbidden thrill. What was sex really like in medieval times? Before we venture further down this often misunderstood path into the very heart of medieval life and its deepest secrets, I'd be immensely grateful if you'd consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support is the wind in the sails of this voyage into the past, allowing me to bring more of these hidden histories to light. And as always, I'm incredibly curious to know who's joining me on this exploration tonight. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it for you as we begin this particular unearthing? Do let me know in the comments below. It truly makes this feel like a shared journey through the ages. Now, let us return to those days of yore. When we think of the Middle Ages and intimacy, our minds often conjure up two conflicting images, either a time of brutal, unrestrained lust, or one of oppressive, joyless piety dictated by an all-powerful church. The truth, as it so often is, lies somewhere far more complex, far more human, and infinitely more fascinating in the intricate tapestry woven between these extremes. We're not just talking about the decrees of popes or the bawdy tales of Chaucer, though they play their part. We're attempting to feel the pulse of real lives, to understand the pressures, the fears, the fleeting joys, and the profound beliefs that shape the sexual landscape of an entire millennium. This exploration will take us through the Church's pervasive doctrines, the stark realities of marriage as both a sacrament and a contract, the chasm between noble bedrooms and peasant trysts, the whispers of forbidden desires, and the often surprising, sometimes bizarre, medical and folk beliefs surrounding the human body and its most primal functions. What did it feel like to navigate love, lust, and duty when your eternal soul was perceived to hang in the balance with every intimate decision? And so you find yourself there, not as a scholar peering through a dusty manuscript, but as a soul born into that era. Forget your 21st century notions of romance, of privacy, of sexual freedom. They are luxuries of a distant future. Your world is one where life is often short, brutal, and governed by forces seen and unseen. The very air you breathe is thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and incense, and with the ever-present doctrines of the Church. This is where our story of medieval sexuality must begin, under the vast, imposing shadow of an institution that sought to govern not just the souls of men and women, but their very bodies. Imagine for a moment that you are a young woman, perhaps barely past your first blood, or a young man, hair just beginning to sprout on your chin. The concept of sexuality as a personal identity, as a spectrum of desires to be explored, simply doesn't exist in your vocabulary. Instead, there is the act, an act freighted with immense significance, primarily for one divine purpose, procreation. The Church, the single most powerful entity shaping your worldview, your morality, your daily life, taught that God had ordained marriage for the continuation of humankind. Be fruitful and multiply. This was the divine imperative, and within that imperative, the sexual act found its primary justification. But here's the rub, the paradox that would echo through every bedchamber. Pleasure itself was suspect, deeply suspect. Rooted in the doctrine of original sin, the pleasure derived from sex, even within the sacred bonds of marriage, was seen as a lingering taint of humanity's fall from grace, a dangerous spark that could ignite the fires of lust and lead the soul astray. What did this mean for you, living under such a doctrine? It meant that sex, ideally, was to be approached with a sense of duty, almost a solemn obligation, rather than unbridled passion. The term marital debt, debitum conjugal, was a very real concept. You owed your spouse your body, and they owed you theirs, for the purpose of procreation, and as a remedy against the sin of fornication outside marriage. It sounds cold, doesn't it? Clinical even. Can you picture it? Lying with your spouse, the weight of centuries of theological debate pressing down upon you. Is this touch permissible? Is this flicker of enjoyment a step towards damnation? Theologians like Augustine and Aquinas wrestled with these questions, their pronouncements filtering down through sermons and confessions, shaping the collective conscience. They argued that if pleasure was the sole motivation, even with one's own spouse, the act became sinful, albeit a venial one. Intention was everything. Yet how could one truly separate the act from its inherent sensations? It was a constant spiritual tightrope walk. And the Church didn't just offer broad pronouncements. It delved into the minutiae with an almost obsessive zeal. This is where the penitentials come in, handbooks for priests, listing various sins and their corresponding penances. And oh, the sexual sins they cataloged. It wasn't just about if you had sex, but how, when, and with whom. Certain positions were deemed more natural, meaning more conducive to procreation and less to pleasure, than others. The woman on top position, for instance, was often condemned as it was thought to be less about procreation and more about female agency and pleasure, a dangerous subversion of the natural order. Oral sex, anal sex, even various forms of foreplay or acts deemed unnatural within marriage, could lead to years of fasting on bread and water, endless recitations of psalms, or lengthy periods of sexual abstinence. Imagine you are there, kneeling in the dim light of the confessional. The priest, often the only educated man you might encounter, his face obscured by a screen, asks you to lay bare your soul, not just your public sins, but the secrets of your marriage bed. Have you? He might begin, his voice a low murmur. Sought pleasure for its own sake. Have you spilled your seed in vain? Have you engaged in acts against nature with your lawfully wedded wife, husband? The shame, the fear, the sheer invasiveness of it. You confess, your voice barely a whisper. Your penance is assigned, and you leave, the weight of your perceived transgressions heavy upon you, determined to be more chaste, more controlled. But you are human. Desire is a powerful current. How long before the whispers in the dark, the touch of a hand, the memory of a forbidden sensation pulled you back towards that perilous edge? The rules were so numerous, so specific. No sex on Sundays, absolutely not. Or on major feast days, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, or during periods of fasting like Lent or Advent, or when your wife was menstruating, or pregnant, or nursing a child, which could last for 2 years or more. Add it all up. Days, weeks, months, stretching into years where marital intimacy was proscribed. It was a calendar of denial, a relentless reminder that your body's urges were a constant test of your faith. You run, you hide, you pray. But the urges remain. What would you do? How would you navigate this labyrinth of spiritual peril and carnal need? This pervasive religious framework was the bedrock upon which all medieval understanding of sex was built. But it wasn't the only force at play. Alongside the pronouncements of the Church, there was the equally powerful institution of marriage itself. And for most people, especially those in the echelons of society with land, titles, or significant wealth to protect, marriage was rarely born of whispered sweet nothings under a moonlit sky. It was a contract, a strategic alliance, a means of consolidating power, forging peace between warring families, or ensuring the legitimate succession of property and titles. Love, if it appeared at all, was often a secondary consideration, a fragile bloom that might, with luck and time, take root in the soil of duty and shared existence. Or it might wither on the vine, leaving behind a husk of obligation. Think of yourself as a young noblewoman. Your life, from an early age, has been a preparation for this. Not for love necessarily, but for a good match. Your father and brothers, perhaps even your mother, deliberate over alliances. Suitors are assessed not for the kindness in their eyes or the poetry on their lips, but for the acreage of their lands, the strength of their armies, the purity of their lineage. One day, you are told, he is chosen. You might have met him once, a brief, formal introduction. Or perhaps you'll see him for the first time at the church door on your wedding day. You are 15, he is 35, a widower with children older than you. Your hand is given, your dowry is settled. Your body, soon to be legally his, is a vessel for the continuation of his line. Can you feel the cold weight of that expectation, the unspoken yet overwhelming pressure to produce an heir, preferably a son, to secure the future of a name, a legacy, a dynasty that stretches back generations? Your worth, in the eyes of many, in the eyes of your new family, is tied directly to your womb. A barren wife was a tragedy, a failure, sometimes even grounds for annulment if it could be proven the marriage was unconsummated or if some impediment could be found. The monthly arrival of your courses could be a private sorrow, a public shame. The longing for a child, not just for maternal affection, but for survival, for status, for validation, in a world that often measured women by their fertility. You lie in the great bed night after night, the tapestries on the wall depicting heroic hunts or biblical scenes, and you pray, not just for your soul, but for a son. The age of consent, as we understand it, was a nebulous concept. Canon law set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, though consummation often waited, particularly if the bride was very young. But very young was relative. Betrothals could happen in infancy, and for a peasant girl working in the fields from the moment she could walk, there was little protection if a lord or his son took a fancy to her. Her body was not her own in ways that are difficult for us to truly comprehend. Her choices, if any, were stark and often brutal. Survival often dictated submission. These were not abstract rules, they were the lived, breathed, often painful realities that shaped every intimate encounter, every whispered word of desire, every silent prayer for either a child or for release. But human nature is a stubborn, resilient thing. Beneath this rigid framework of doctrine and duty, beneath the cold calculations of dynastic marriages and the ever-watchful eye of the Church, the human heart continued to beat. It yearned, it desired, it sometimes loved, fiercely and defiantly. The official script of medieval sexuality, written by theologians and lawmakers, was one of control and procreation. But what of the unwritten scripts, the ones whispered in secret, enacted in defiance, or simply lived out in the quiet, unrecorded moments of ordinary lives? What happened when the preacher's voice faded and the darkness of the bedchamber offered a fleeting illusion of privacy? The story is far from over. It is merely beginning to unfold its most complex and perhaps most surprisingly human chapters. Okay, let us draw back another layer of the medieval tapestry, moving from the stark pronouncements of the church and the cold calculus of dynastic marriage into the more shadowed, often more passionate, realms of human experience. The official script, as we've seen, was rigid, demanding, and often unforgiving, but humanity has always been adept at writing its own lines in the margins, hasn't it? So, you find yourself still within that world, a world where the official narrative of sex was one of solemn duty and procreative necessity. But what if your heart, that unruly organ, refused to read from the approved script? What if desire, raw and untamed, or perhaps a more tender, yearning affection, began to bloom in defiance of doctrine and societal expectation? This is where the story of medieval intimacy grows infinitely more complex and in many ways more relatable. For even under the most repressive regimes, the human spirit seeks connection, seeks pleasure, seeks love in its myriad forms. And the Middle Ages, for all its piety, was no exception. It pulsed with an undercurrent of desires that ecclesiastical law could condemn but never fully extinguish. Consider the phenomenon of courtly love, or fin-amour, as it was known in the troubadour traditions of southern France. Here you step into a world of knights and ladies, of whispered poetry and yearning glances exchanged across crowded banquet halls. This wasn't necessarily about consummation, though the line was often dangerously blurred. It was about devotion, often to an unattainable, usually married noblewoman. You are a young knight, perhaps, pledged to a lady far above your station. Your love for her is meant to ennoble you, to inspire you to acts of bravery, chivalry, and artistic expression. You wear her colors in tournaments. You compose songs praising her beauty, her virtue, her grace, songs that might be sung publicly, yet carry a coded, intensely personal message. Is this love real? Or is it a sophisticated game, a literary convention, a way for a restless warrior class to channel its energies and emotions? Historians still debate its true nature, but for those who lived it or aspired to it, the emotions felt undeniably potent. The longing, the adoration, the exquisite pain of unrequited or impossible love. These became themes that resonated through medieval literature, from the Arthurian legends of Lancelot and Guinevere to the tales of Tristan and Isolde. Imagine yourself as that lady, the object of such devotion. Your marriage, as we've discussed, was likely an arrangement. Your husband, a powerful lord, may be kind, or he may be indifferent, even cruel. He may be frequently absent, engaged in warfare or political machinations. And then there is this knight, his eyes full of fervent admiration. He doesn't see you merely as a womb to bear heirs or a political pawn. He sees you, or claims to see you, as an ideal, a muse. Does it stir something within you, a sense of power perhaps, in a world where your agency is otherwise so limited? A flicker of romance in a life defined by duty? The rules of this game were delicate. Discretion was paramount. A hint of scandal could destroy reputations, shatter alliances, even lead to violence. Yet the allure of this idealized, often unfulfilled passion was undeniable. It offered an escape, a fantasy, a realm where emotion, rather than transaction, reigned supreme. But what happened when that idealized love tipped over into physical desire, when the yearning glance became a stolen touch, a secret rendezvous? The stakes became terrifyingly high. Adultery, especially for a woman, was a sin of profound gravity, carrying not just spiritual damnation, but dire social and legal consequences. And what of those outside the gilded cages of the nobility? What of you, the peasant farmer, the artisan, the merchant's wife? Did love and desire play out differently in the cobbled streets and muddy fields? Here, the grand poetic gestures of courtly love were largely absent. Life was more immediate, more pragmatic. Marriage, while still carrying religious weight, was also a partnership for survival. You needed a wife to manage the household, bear and raise children who would become helping hands and share the relentless toil. You needed a husband to provide, to protect. Yet, to assume that love and affection were absent from these unions would be a profound disservice to the countless ordinary people who built their lives together. Their love might not have been sung by troubadours, but it was expressed in shared burdens, in mutual reliance, in the quiet comfort of a familiar presence at the end of a hard day. However, the human heart, regardless of social standing, is prone to wander. Temptation did not confine itself to castle walls. If you were a young apprentice, far from home, living in a bustling town, opportunities for encounters outside the marital bond or before marriage certainly existed. Taverns, festivals, even the crowded living conditions of medieval cities could provide a backdrop for illicit trysts. The Church condemned fornication, sex before marriage, with vigor. But how effective were these condemnations when youthful passions ran high and opportunities, however risky, presented themselves? You hide. You hope no one saw. You pray for forgiveness. The fear of pregnancy outside of wedlock was a constant, terrifying shadow for any unmarried woman. A child born out of wedlock faced social stigma, legal disadvantages, and an uncertain future. For the woman, the consequences could be devastating: ostracism, loss of reputation, perhaps even destitution. What then of attempts to control fertility? This is a realm shrouded in even deeper silence and condemnation. The Church was unequivocal. Any act that deliberately sought to prevent conception was a grave sin, an interference with God's plan. Spilling seed outside the natural vessel for procreation was anathema. Yet whisper networks undoubtedly existed. Women shared knowledge, folk remedies, herbs, perhaps cruder methods, passed down through generations. Were they effective? Likely not consistently, and some could be dangerous. But the desire to control one's own body, to limit the number of mouths to feed in a world of precarious sustenance, or to avoid the dangers of childbirth, which were very real, many women died in childbed, was a powerful motivator. You might seek out an old woman in the village, one rumored to know such things, a furtive exchange, a bitter potion, a desperate hope. The medical texts of the time, often drawing from ancient Greek and Roman sources, sometimes discussed substances believed to prevent conception or induce menstruation, but these were generally framed within a scholarly rather than practical context for the common person, and always under the shadow of religious prohibition. The line between medicine, magic, and sin was often blurred beyond recognition. And what if your desires didn't fit the neat, procreative, heterosexual mold prescribed by society and the Church? The concept of homosexuality as a distinct identity did not exist in the medieval lexicon. Instead, there were acts. Sodomy, a term encompassing a range of non-procreative sexual acts, including those between individuals of the same sex, was condemned in the strongest possible terms. It was the peccatum mutum, the sin that dare not speak its name, often equated with heresy and treason, punishable in some regions and times by death, often by fire. You are there, perhaps a monk in a secluded monastery, or a soldier in a close-knit company, or a woman whose deepest affections lie with another woman. The fear must have been immense, the isolation profound. Any expression of such desires had to be deeply, terrifyingly clandestine. Yet glimpses appear in the historical record, often through condemnations, court records of trials, or penitential manuals that listed penances for such acts. These records, by their very nature, paint a picture of persecution rather than lived experience. But they tell us that these desires existed, that people acted upon them, and that they faced terrible risks in doing so. Imagine the internal conflict, your deepest feelings branded as an abomination, a direct path to eternal damnation. How do you reconcile your faith with your nature? How do you find solace or even survive in such a world? The silence surrounding these experiences in most historical narratives is deafening, but it does not mean absence. It speaks to a level of repression that is difficult for us to fully grasp. Even within heterosexual relationships, the focus on procreation often overshadowed other aspects of intimacy. But what about pleasure for its own sake? Even within marriage, we saw how the church deemed it suspect. Yet medieval literature, particularly the more bawdy fabliaux, short, comical, often obscene stories popular among various social classes, paints a very different picture. These tales are filled with lusty monks, unfaithful wives, clever lovers, and a frank, earthy acknowledgement of sexual desire and pleasure. They reveal a popular culture that, while perhaps not openly defying the church, certainly recognized and reveled in the messier, more humorous, and more carnal aspects of human nature. Were these stories pure fantasy, a form of escapism, or did they reflect, at least in part, a more pragmatic, less guilt-ridden attitude toward sex that coexisted alongside official morality? Perhaps you hear such a tale told around a crackling fire, or by a traveling storyteller at a village fair. You laugh. You nudge your neighbor. For a moment, the heavy weight of sin and penance seems to lift, replaced by a shared understanding of human frailty and appetite. It is crucial to remember, too, that medical understanding of the body was vastly different. The humoral theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks, posited that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sex was often seen as a way to regulate these humors. For men, regular emission was sometimes considered necessary for health, to prevent a buildup of seed, which could lead to melancholy or other ailments. For women, the theories were more complex and often contradictory. Some physicians believed that female orgasm was necessary for conception, a stark contrast to the theological emphasis on pleasure being sinful. Others debated the very nature of female pleasure and its role in the body. You consult a physician, perhaps for persistent headaches or a lingering sadness. Among his recommendations, alongside dietary changes and bloodletting, might be advice regarding your marital relations, more frequent or perhaps less, depending on his diagnosis of your humoral imbalance. It's a world where the spiritual, the physical, and the medical were inextricably intertwined, often in ways that seem bizarre to us now. Imagine trying to navigate your intimate life when your priest tells you one thing, your doctor another, and the local wise woman whispers a third, entirely different piece of advice. Whose counsel do you follow when your body, your health, and your eternal soul are all at stake? The medieval world was not monolithic. Attitudes and practices varied across regions, across social strata, and over the vast span of the 1,000 years we call the Middle Ages. What might have been tolerated in a remote village could be fiercely prosecuted in a city under the sway of a zealous bishop. The experiences of a queen, surrounded by courtiers and confessors, were worlds apart from those of a shepherdess living a life dictated by the seasons and the needs of her flock. Yet, beneath these differences, the fundamental human experiences of desire, love, fear, and the search for connection remained. The story of medieval sex is not just a story of repression, but also one of resilience, of adaptation, and of the enduring, irrepressible complexity of human nature, finding ways to express itself even in the most challenging of circumstances. But there are still more chambers to unlock, more hidden alcoves to explore in this vast, intricate castle of the past. The impact of disease, the realities of childbirth beyond just the pressure to conceive, and the specific ways in which power and sex intersected in even more brutal forms than dynastic marriage, all await our gaze. All right, let us continue our descent into the intimate realities of the medieval world. peeling back layers that reveal not just belief and custom, but the raw, often unforgiving physicality of life and the stark ways power could manifest in the most personal of spheres. We've spoken of doctrine, of desire, of the complex dance between love and duty. But now the shadows lengthen, and we must confront the less romanticized, often brutal, facts that shaped medieval sexuality and family life. The very air, as we've said, was thick with more than just incense and wood smoke. It was also thick with the ever-present specter of disease, the agonizing perils of childbirth, and the crushing weight of power wielded without restraint. You've navigated the intricate rules of the church, perhaps even found a fragile bloom of affection within an arranged marriage, or felt the illicit thrill of a forbidden desire. But now, imagine the most fundamental of human experiences, bringing new life into this precarious world. Childbirth. For you, a medieval woman, this was not the sanitized, medically managed event it often is today. It was a terrifying crucible, a battle waged in your own bed, often surrounded by female relatives, and a local midwife whose knowledge was a tapestry woven from generations of experience, folk wisdom, and perhaps a touch of what the church might deem superstition. There were no epidurals to dull the pain, no sterile operating rooms if complications arose. There was your body straining, tearing. There was prayer, fervent and desperate. The mortality rate for both mother and child was heartbreakingly high. Each pregnancy was a gamble with death. Can you feel it? The months of carrying a child, a mix of hope and trepidation, culminating in hours, perhaps days, of agonizing labor. The midwife, her hands worn from countless such deliveries, might offer herbal concoctions to ease the pain or hasten the birth, some perhaps mildly effective, others useless, a few even dangerous. She murmurs encouragements, invocations to saints. Saint Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, was a popular appeal, but ultimately it was your strength and sheer chance that determined the outcome. The sun beats down outside or the wind howls through the shutters. Inside, there is only this pain, this effort. You push, you scream, you pray. Will the child live? Will you live to see it? If the baby was born alive and seemed likely to survive, baptism was urgent. Infant mortality was so common that delaying the sacrament, and thus risking an unbaptized soul entering eternity, was unthinkable. The relief, if both mother and child survived, must have been immense, almost ecstatic. But the shadow of loss was never far. Many women endured multiple pregnancies, only to see half their children die before reaching adulthood. Each loss, a fresh stab of grief, a renewed awareness of life's fragility in this era. How did this constant proximity to death in its most intimate form, the death of infants, the death of mothers in childbirth, shape the emotional landscape of love and family? Did it foster a certain stoicism, a necessary hardening of the heart? Or did it make the bonds with surviving children all the more precious, all the more fiercely protected? And then there was disease, an ever-present companion in medieval life. Sanitation, as we understand it, was rudimentary at best. Water sources were often contaminated. People lived in close quarters with animals. The understanding of how diseases spread was mired in theories of miasmas, bad air, or humoral imbalances. In such an environment, illnesses that could be linked, rightly or wrongly, to sexual activity carried a particular terror and stigma. While the great wave of syphilis is generally associated with the period after Columbus's voyages, other conditions that could be transmitted sexually, or were believed to be, were rampant. Gonorrhea, various sores and infections, these were a grim reality. Leprosy, while not solely sexually transmitted, often carried strong moral condemnation, and lepers were ostracized, sometimes forced to wear bells to warn of their approach. Imagine the fear, a suspicious rash, a persistent discharge. Was it a sign of sin? Divine retribution for a moment of weakness, a forbidden encounter? The Church often framed illness as a consequence of sin, and sexual transgressions were prime candidates for such divine punishment. This added another layer of anxiety and guilt to intimate relations. You feel a pain. You see a mark. Is it God's judgment? Would you confess it? To whom? The local healer, whose remedies might be based on herbs and charms? Or the priest who might prescribe prayer and penance as the only cure? This brings us to a darker intersection: sex and power, stripped bare of even the pretense of courtly love or marital contract. We must speak of coercion, of violence. The concept of droit du seigneur, or ius prime noctis, the supposed right of a feudal lord to take the virginity of his serfs' brides, is a contentious one among historians. Many argue it was more myth than widespread practice, perhaps a later romantic or anti-feudal invention. However, whether it was a formalized right or not, the underlying reality of power imbalance was undeniable. A lord, a knight, any man in a position of authority, held immense sway over the lives and bodies of those beneath him, particularly women. You are a peasant girl working your lord's land. His son, or perhaps the Lord himself, casts his eye upon you. What recourse do you truly have? Your word against his? The local priest might be beholden to the Lord, your family dependent on his goodwill for their survival. The fear of reprisal for yourself or your loved ones would be immense. Submission, however unwilling, often became the path of least resistance, a bitter pill swallowed to ensure survival. It is a chilling thought, the casual, almost unthinking exploitation that such power structures allowed. And rape, the most brutal assertion of power through sexual violence, was a grim feature of medieval life, as it has been in all ages. Legal codes acknowledged it, prescribed punishments, fines, mutilation, sometimes death, depending on the status of the victim and perpetrator and the specific legal traditions of the region. But justice was often elusive. A woman's testimony might be questioned, her reputation scrutinized. Was she of good character? Did she cry out loud enough? Did she resist sufficiently? The burden of proof, the shame, the societal tendency to blame the victim, these are not new phenomena. Imagine enduring such an assault and then facing a system that might doubt you, even condemn you for somehow provoking it. The psychological scars added to the physical trauma would be profound. And during times of war, which were frequent in the Middle Ages, rape was a common, horrific tool of conquest and terror. You are a woman in a besieged city. The walls are breached. Soldiers, drunk on victory and bloodlust, pour through the streets. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Your body becomes a spoil of war. This was the terrifying reality for countless women, their experiences often silenced in the grand narratives of battles and kingdoms. The sun beat down, water was gone, so was hope. You run, you hide, you pray. But the soldiers are everywhere. In the towns and growing cities, another facet of medieval sexuality existed, often in plain sight yet officially condemned: prostitution. Driven by poverty, by lack of other opportunities, or sometimes by force, women sold their bodies. Their existence was a paradox. The Church condemned prostitution as sinful, yet some theologians and civic authorities tolerated it, sometimes even regulating it by confining it to specific districts or stews. The reasoning? It was often seen as a necessary evil, a way to protect respectable women from the lusts of unmarried men, students, or soldiers, and to prevent what was seen as the greater sin of sodomy. Think of that logic. An outlet for male desire that sacrificed one group of women to supposedly safeguard another. You are a woman in such a position. Life is harsh, dangerous. You face disease, violence from clients or pimps, and constant social ostracism, even as your services are tacitly accepted. Perhaps you send what little money you earn back to your family in the countryside. Perhaps you dream of escape, a different life, but the chances are slim. The church might offer paths to redemption, repentance, entry into a convent specifically for fallen women. But the stigma was hard to erase. You live on the margins, a ghost in the bustling life of the city, a constant reminder of the complex, often hypocritical, ways society tried to manage and control human sexuality. The fabric of medieval intimacy was therefore woven with these dark threads: the perilous passage of childbirth, the constant threat of disease interpreted through a moral lens, and the brutal realities of power imbalances that left many vulnerable to exploitation and violence. It paints a picture far removed from chivalric romances or simple piety. It underscores that for many, particularly women and those in lower social strata, control over their own bodies and sexual lives was a luxury they simply did not possess. Their experiences were shaped by forces largely outside their influence, by the lord in his castle, by the priest in his pulpit, by the diseases that swept through their communities, and by the fundamental, often terrifying, biology of their own bodies. But even amidst these harsh realities, the human need for connection, for comfort, for some measure of control over one's destiny continued to assert itself in myriad, often hidden, ways. The story doesn't end in despair, but it must acknowledge the depths of these struggles to truly understand the resilience that often emerged from them. And as we look closer, we begin to see how these very struggles also fueled different kinds of knowledge, different forms of resistance, however subtle, in the ongoing human drama of sex and society. All right, let us continue our descent into the intimate realities of the medieval world, peeling back layers that reveal not just belief and custom, but the raw, often unforgiving physicality of life and the stark ways power could manifest in the most personal of spheres. We've spoken of doctrine, of desire, of the complex dance between love and duty. But now the shadows lengthen, and we must confront the less romanticized, often brutal facts that shaped medieval sexuality and family life. The very air, as we've said, was thick with more than just incense and wood smoke. It was also thick with the ever-present specter of disease, the agonizing perils of childbirth, and the crushing weight of power wielded without restraint. You've navigated the intricate rules of the church, perhaps even found a fragile bloom of affection within an arranged marriage, or felt the illicit thrill of a forbidden desire. But now, imagine the most fundamental of human experiences, bringing new life into this precarious world. Childbirth. For you, a medieval woman, this was not the sanitized, medically managed event it often is today. It was a terrifying crucible, a battle waged in your own bed, often surrounded by female relatives and a local midwife, whose knowledge was a tapestry woven from generations of experience, folk wisdom, and perhaps a touch of what the church might deem superstition. There were no epidurals to dull the pain, no sterile operating rooms if complications arose. There was your body, straining, tearing. There was prayer, fervent and desperate. The mortality rate for both mother and child was heartbreakingly high. Each pregnancy was a gamble with death. Can you feel it? The months of carrying a child, a mix of hope and trepidation, culminating in hours, perhaps days, of agonizing labor. The midwife, her hands worn from countless such deliveries, might offer herbal concoctions to ease the pain or hasten the birth, some perhaps mildly effective, others useless, a few even dangerous. She murmurs encouragements, invocations to saints. Saint Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, was a popular appeal. But ultimately, it was your strength and sheer chance that determined the outcome. The sun beats down outside, or the wind howls through the shutters. Inside, there is only this pain, this effort. You push, you scream, you pray. Will the child live? Will you live to see it? If the baby was born alive and seemed likely to survive, baptism was urgent. Infant mortality was so common that delaying the sacrament and thus risking an unbaptized soul entering eternity was unthinkable. The relief, if both mother and child survived, must have been immense, almost ecstatic. But the shadow of loss was never far. Many women endured multiple pregnancies, only to see half their children die before reaching adulthood. Each loss, a fresh stab of grief, a renewed awareness of life's fragility in this era. How did this constant proximity to death in its most intimate form, the death of infants, the death of mothers in childbirth, shape the emotional landscape of love and family? Did it foster a certain stoicism, a necessary hardening of the heart? Or did it make the bonds with surviving children all the more precious, all the more fiercely protected? And then there was disease, an ever-present companion in medieval life. Sanitation, as we understand it, was rudimentary at best. Water sources were often contaminated. People lived in close quarters with animals. The understanding of how diseases spread was mired in theories of miasmas, bad air, or humoral imbalances. In such an environment, illnesses that could be linked, rightly or wrongly, to sexual activity carried a particular terror and stigma. While the great wave of syphilis is generally associated with the period after Columbus's voyages, other conditions that could be transmitted sexually, or were believed to be, were rampant. Gonorrhea, various sores and infections, these were a grim reality. Leprosy, while not solely sexually transmitted, often carried strong moral condemnation, and lepers were ostracized, sometimes forced to wear bells to warn of their approach. Imagine the fear, a suspicious rash, a persistent discharge. Was it a sign of sin? Divine retribution for a moment of weakness, a forbidden encounter? The Church often framed illness as a consequence of sin, and sexual transgressions were prime candidates for such divine punishment. This added another layer of anxiety and guilt to intimate relations. You feel a pain, you see a mark. Is it God's judgment? Would you confess it? To whom? The local healer, whose remedies might be based on herbs and charms? Or the priest, who might prescribe prayer and penance as the only cure? This brings us to a darker intersection, sex and power, stripped bare of even the pretense of courtly love or marital contract. We must speak of coercion, of violence. The concept of droit du seigneur, or ius primae noctis, the supposed right of a feudal lord to take the virginity of his serfs' brides, is a contentious one among historians. Many argue it was more myth than widespread practice, perhaps a later romantic or anti-feudal invention. However, whether it was a formalized right or not, the underlying reality of power imbalance was undeniable. A lord, a knight, any man in a position of authority held immense sway over the lives and bodies of those beneath him, particularly women. You are a peasant girl working your lord's land. His son, or perhaps the Lord himself, casts his eye upon you. What recourse do you truly have? Your word against his? The local priest might be beholden to the Lord. Your family dependent on his goodwill for their survival. The fear of reprisal for yourself or your loved ones would be immense. Submission, however unwilling, often became the path of least resistance, a bitter pill swallowed to ensure survival. It is a chilling thought. The casual, almost unthinking exploitation that such power structures allowed. And rape, the most brutal assertion of power through sexual violence, was a grim feature of medieval life as it has been in all ages. Legal codes acknowledged it, prescribed punishments, fines, mutilation, sometimes death, depending on the status of the victim and perpetrator and the specific legal traditions of the region. But justice was often elusive. A woman's testimony might be questioned, her reputation scrutinized. Was she of good character? Did she cry out loud enough? Did she resist sufficiently? The burden of proof, the shame, the societal tendency to blame the victim, these are not new phenomena. Imagine enduring such an assault, and then facing a system that might doubt you, even condemn you for somehow provoking it. The psychological scars added to the physical trauma would be profound. And during times of war, which were frequent in the Middle Ages, rape was a common, horrific tool of conquest and terror. You are a woman in a besieged city. The walls are breached. Soldiers, drunk on victory and bloodlust, pour through the streets. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Your body becomes a spoil of war. This was the terrifying reality for countless women, their experiences often silenced in the grand narratives of battles and kingdoms. The sun beat down. Water was gone. So was hope. You run, you hide, you pray. But the soldiers are everywhere. In the towns and growing cities, another facet of medieval sexuality existed, often in plain sight, yet officially condemned: prostitution. Driven by poverty, by lack of other opportunities, or sometimes by force, women sold their bodies. Their existence was a paradox. The Church condemned prostitution as sinful, yet some theologians and civic authorities tolerated it, sometimes even regulating it by confining it to specific districts or stews. The reasoning: it was often seen as a necessary evil, a way to protect respectable women from the lusts of unmarried men, students, or soldiers, and to prevent what was seen as the greater sin of sodomy. Think of that logic. An outlet for male desire that sacrificed one group of women to supposedly safeguard another? You are a woman in such a position. Life is harsh, dangerous. You face disease, violence from clients or pimps, and constant social ostracism, even as your services are tacitly accepted. Perhaps you send what little money you earn back to your family in the countryside. Perhaps you dream of escape, a different life. But the chances are slim. The Church might offer paths to redemption, repentance, entry into a convent specifically for fallen women, but the stigma was hard to erase. You live on the margins, a ghost in the bustling life of the city, a constant reminder of the complex, often hypocritical, ways society tried to manage and control human sexuality. The fabric of medieval intimacy was therefore woven with these dark threads: the perilous passage of childbirth, the constant threat of disease interpreted through a moral lens, and the brutal realities of power imbalances that left many vulnerable to exploitation and violence. It paints a picture far removed from chivalric romances or simple piety. It underscores that for many, particularly women and those in lower social strata, control over their own bodies and sexual lives was a luxury they simply did not possess. Their experiences were shaped by forces largely outside their influence, by the lord in his castle, by the priest in his pulpit, by the diseases that swept through their communities, and by the fundamental, often terrifying, biology of their own bodies. But even amidst these harsh realities, the human need for connection, for comfort, for some measure of control over one's destiny, continued to assert itself in myriad, often hidden ways. The story doesn't end in despair, but it must acknowledge the depths of these struggles to truly understand the resilience that often emerged from them. And as we look closer, we begin to see how these very struggles also fueled different kinds of knowledge, different forms of resistance, however subtle, in the ongoing human drama of sex and society. Right. We've waded through some of the bleakest waters of medieval intimacy, the terrors of childbirth, the shadow of disease, the crushing weight of power wielded without conscience. It would be easy, wouldn't it, to paint the entire era with this dark brush, to see only victims and oppressors, sin and suffering? But human beings are rarely so simple. Even in the face of overwhelming hardship, within the tightest constraints, the human spirit seeks light, seeks agency, seeks to carve out spaces for itself. And so, you find yourself still in that world, but now perhaps you begin to look for the cracks in the stone walls, the glimmers of resilience, the subtle ways people navigated, and sometimes even subverted, the formidable structures that governed their most private lives. The visual atmosphere might subtly shift again, perhaps allowing for moments of softer light, or focusing on communal scenes, crafts, or expressions of folk culture. The music could take on a more reflective, or perhaps even a slightly more hopeful, though still grounded tone. Imagine the sheer weight of societal expectation, the ever-watchful eyes of your neighbors, the pronouncements of the priest ringing in your ears. In a world where your reputation, your good name, was paramount, often more valuable than material wealth, especially for a woman, how did you navigate the treacherous currents of desire and discretion? The community was both a source of support and a relentless panopticon. Gossip whispered over washing at the river, shared in the marketplace, or muttered after evening prayers was a powerful force. It could build reputations, and it could destroy them. You lived your life on a very public stage, even your most private moments potentially subject to scrutiny and speculation. Did young John spend too long talking to Mary by the well? Was the widow Agnes receiving male visitors after dark? These weren't idle curiosities, they were threads in the social fabric, ways the community policed its own boundaries and reinforced its norms. For you, a young woman, maintaining an untarnished reputation was critical for a good marriage, for your family's standing. A whisper of indiscretion could ruin your prospects. So you learn to be careful. You learn the art of subtle glances, of coded words if you dare to communicate affection outside approved channels. You rely on trusted friends, perhaps a sister or a cousin, to act as intermediaries, to carry messages, to provide cover. Female networks, though rarely documented in grand historical narratives, must have been vital. Women supporting each other through childbirth, sharing knowledge about herbs and healing, some of which, as we've noted, might have pertained to fertility or its prevention, offering comfort in times of grief, or simply providing a space where a woman could speak more freely than she might with her husband or father. Can you picture it? The hushed conversations, the shared understanding, the silent pacts of solidarity in a world largely dominated by male authority. These were not acts of open rebellion, but they were forms of agency, ways of navigating and coping with a restrictive system. And what about when things went wrong, when a pregnancy occurred outside of marriage, despite all precautions? The shame was immense, the consequences dire. Yet communities, for all their judgment, sometimes found ways to accommodate, to absorb these lapses, especially if the families involved had standing, or if a solution, like a hastily arranged marriage, could be found. Infanticide, though a desperate and horrifying act, sadly did occur, often a tragic consequence of a woman's utter desperation and lack of options. But there were also instances of abandoned infants being taken in by monasteries or compassionate families. The narrative of sin and condemnation was powerful, but it wasn't always the final word. Human compassion, however inconsistently applied, sometimes pierced through the rigid doctrines. Let's turn our gaze for a moment to a very different setting, yet one intrinsically linked to the medieval understanding of sex and the body, the monastery or the convent. Here you dedicate your life to God, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. For some, this was a genuine spiritual calling, a desire to escape the temptations and corruptions of the world. For others, particularly women from noble families, the convent could be a respectable alternative if a suitable marriage wasn't forthcoming or a place of refuge. But what did chastity truly mean in these enclosed single-sex environments? The ideal was a complete renunciation of carnal desire, a redirection of all love and longing towards the divine. You meditate, you pray, you fast, you engage in manual labor. The rhythm of the monastic day, with its 7 daily offices of prayer, was designed to structure every waking moment, to leave little room for wayward thoughts. Yet, human nature, even within cloistered walls, remained. Theologians and monastic rule-makers were acutely aware of the temptations of the flesh. Strict rules governed interactions between monks and nuns, and even among members of the same sex within the monastery. Particular friendships, intense emotional bonds between individuals, were often discouraged, seen as a distraction from devotion to God and a potential gateway to more physical expressions of affection. Medieval texts sometimes allude to concerns about same-sex intimacy within monastic communities, often framed again through the lens of sin and the need for vigilance. Imagine the internal struggle. You've renounced the world, but your body still feels, your heart still yearns for connection. Is that yearning for a fellow monk or nun a spiritual companionship or something more perilous to your vows? The lines could be incredibly blurry, the psychological torment immense. Some scholars suggest that certain forms of mystical writing from this period, with its passionate, ecstatic language describing union with Christ, might have been, in part, a sublimation of earthly desires, a channeling of intense emotional and even erotic energy into a spiritual framework. The intensity of devotion described by figures like Hadavich or Mechthild of Magdeburg is breathtaking, and it certainly speaks to a profound capacity for love, albeit one directed towards the divine. But not all monastic life was purely spiritual torment or sublime ecstasy. Monasteries were also centers of learning, of agriculture, of administration. They were complex communities, and like any human community, they had their share of internal politics, friendships, and yes, sometimes scandals that breached the walls of propriety. Visitations, inspections by bishops or higher monastic authorities sometimes uncovered irregularities, including lapses in chastity that led to penance and reform. Life within the cloister was an attempt to create a heaven on earth, but it was populated by mortals. Now, let us step back outside those walls into the bustling, messy, secular world again. We've talked about arranged marriages, about the church's strictures. But did this mean that genuine love, affection, and companionship between spouses were impossible or even rare? It's a difficult question to answer definitively, as personal letters detailing intimate feelings from ordinary people are scarce from this period. Most surviving documents are legal, economic, or religious. Yet, we catch glimpses. Wills sometimes contain tender expressions of affection for a surviving spouse. Epitaphs mourn the loss of a beloved partner. Even within the framework of marriages arranged for pragmatic reasons, shared lives, children, common struggles, and mutual respect could, and often did, foster deep bonds. Think of it. You are bound to this person for life. Your fortunes are intertwined. You rely on each other daily. Is it so surprising that affection might grow, that a comfortable companionship, a deep-seated loyalty, could develop even if passionate, romantic love wasn't the initial foundation? Consider the Paston Letters, a famous collection of correspondence from a Norfolk gentry family in the 15th century. While many letters deal with legal disputes and property management, they also offer insights into family relationships. We see evidence of parents deeply concerned for their children's well-being and marriages, and glimpses of affection between husbands and wives, alongside the expected societal pressures. Margaret Paston, a formidable woman who managed family affairs while her husband was away, corresponded regularly with him. Her letters are full of news, requests, and an underlying sense of partnership. This isn't the fiery passion of a Lancelot and Guinevere, but it is a testament to the enduring, practical love that underpinned many medieval families. You write to your spouse, miles away. You detail the harvest, the children's health, the local disputes. You ask for news. You express concern for their safety. Is this not a form of love deeply rooted in shared existence? And what of the simple, unrecorded moments? A shared joke, a comforting hand in a time of sickness, the quiet satisfaction of watching your children play. These everyday intimacies often go unrecorded by history, which tends to focus on the grand and the dramatic. But they form the true texture of many lives. We must be careful not to impose our modern, romanticized notions of love onto the past, but equally, we must avoid dismissing the possibility of genuine emotional connection simply because the societal framework was different. Perhaps you and your spouse, after years of shared toil and raising a family, sit by the fire in the evening. The day's work is done. The children are asleep. A comfortable silence settles between you, born of long familiarity and unspoken understanding. This, too, is a part of the story of medieval intimacy. Even the Church's emphasis on procreation, while often presented as a cold imperative, could have a flip side. The joy of children, the hope for the future they represented, was a powerful emotional force. For a couple who longed for children and were blessed with them, the sexual act, even if framed by duty, could also be associated with this profound joy and fulfillment. The desire for heirs was not just about property, it was about legacy, about continuing the family line, about seeing a part of yourself live on. This deeply human urge transcended mere doctrine. The medieval world was certainly not a sexual utopia, nor was it a universally joyless landscape of repression. It was a complex tapestry of belief and behavior, of ideals and realities, often in stark contradiction. People found ways to live, to love, to desire, and to cope within the frameworks available to them. They built families, forged bonds, and experienced the full spectrum of human emotions, much as we do today, albeit under vastly different stars. But our journey isn't quite over. We still need to consider how these attitudes evolved over the long medieval period, and how the end of the Middle Ages brought with it shifts that would begin to reshape the landscape of sex and intimacy, leading towards the world we know, yet still carrying echoes of that distant, fire-lit past. Excellent. We've explored the sacred and the profane, the prescribed and the hidden, the joys and the profound sorrows that characterized intimate life in the Middle Ages. We've seen individuals navigating a world of rigid doctrines, societal pressures, and the raw realities of biology and power. But the medieval period wasn't static. It was a vast expanse of time, nearly 1,000 years, during which attitudes, while often deeply rooted, did subtly shift and evolve. And as this era drew towards its close, new forces began to stir, forces that would eventually contribute to a significant reshaping of how Western society viewed sex, marriage, and the self. You find yourself now not at the height of what we might call the Dark Ages, but perhaps in the later medieval period, the 14th or 15th century. The Black Death has swept through Europe, leaving unimaginable devastation in its wake, but also paradoxically creating social and economic shifts. Towns and cities are growing in importance, fostering a burgeoning merchant class with its own values and aspirations. Universities are expanding, and while theology still reigns supreme, new intellectual currents, what we would later call humanism, are beginning to place a greater emphasis on human experience and classical learning. How did these broader changes ripple outwards to affect the intimate lives of ordinary people? One subtle but significant shift can be seen in the evolving discourse around marriage. While procreation remained its primary justification in the eyes of the Church, and strategic alliances were still paramount for the nobility, there was a growing, albeit slow, acknowledgement of the importance of companionship and mutual affection within marriage. You might see this reflected in some theological writings or in advice literature aimed at married couples. It wasn't a sudden embrace of romantic love as the sole basis for marriage, far from it, but rather a growing recognition that a successful and harmonious marriage, even when arranged, benefited from shared respect, loyalty, and even affection. The idea of the companionate marriage, though more fully developed in later centuries, had some of its earliest tentative roots here. Think of it. After centuries of emphasizing marriage primarily as a duty and a sacrament for procreation, the idea that it could also be a source of personal comfort and mutual support began to gain a little more traction. This wasn't necessarily a rebellion against church doctrine, but rather an evolving interpretation, perhaps influenced by the lived experiences of countless couples who found such companionship essential for navigating the hardships of life. Consider the rise of the urban bourgeoisie, the merchant families in flourishing towns like Florence, Ghent, or Bruges. For them, marriage was certainly about consolidating wealth and business interests, but their lives were also increasingly centered around the household as a unit of both production and family life. You are perhaps the wife of a prosperous wool merchant. Your husband is often busy with trade, perhaps even traveling. You manage the household, supervise servants, perhaps even assist with aspects of the business. Your partnership is crucial to the family's success. In this context, mutual respect and a degree of affection would be not just desirable, but practically necessary. The letters and household accounts from such families sometimes reveal a pragmatic intimacy, a shared enterprise where husband and wife work together, their lives deeply intertwined. This environment might have fostered a different kind of marital bond than that found in the highly ritualized and often emotionally distant world of high nobility or the purely survival-driven unions of the poorest peasants. Furthermore, the trauma of the Black Death, which in some regions wiped out a third or even half the population, had profound, if complex, effects. In the immediate aftermath, there was, in some places, a documented surge in marriages and births, a desperate, instinctual drive to repopulate, to reaffirm life in the face of so much death. But it also, arguably, led to a shift in sensibilities. When life is so demonstrably fragile, when death can strike anyone, regardless of piety or status, it can lead to a more intense focus on the here and now. Some historians argue that this period saw a rise in what might be termed a more individualistic outlook, a greater awareness of personal experience. Did this translate into a greater emphasis on personal choice or emotional fulfillment in relationships? It's difficult to say definitively, and the impact varied greatly. But the profound shock of the plague undoubtedly unsettled old certainties and may have contributed to a slow erosion of the most rigid medieval worldviews. You have survived. Many you knew did not. Does this change how you view your life, your relationships, your fleeting time on earth? Literacy was also slowly increasing, especially in urban centers. While books were still precious, handwritten commodities, more people, particularly men of the merchant class and some women, were gaining access to reading and writing. This opened up new avenues for communication and self-expression. We see more personal letters, more diaries, though still predominantly from the literate elite. And with literacy came exposure to a wider range of ideas. The rediscovery of classical texts during the early Renaissance began to reintroduce pre-Christian philosophies and attitudes, some of which had a more worldly, less sin-focused view of human nature and even pleasure. This wasn't an immediate overthrow of medieval morality, but it planted seeds that would flower more fully in the centuries to come. Imagine encountering, for the first time, ideas from ancient philosophers who spoke of love and desire in terms very different from those of your parish priest. Would it not spark new thoughts, new questions? However, we must be cautious not to overstate these changes or paint a picture of sudden liberation. The Church remained immensely powerful. The fundamental doctrines concerning sex, sin, and salvation were not abandoned. In fact, in some ways, the later Middle Ages saw periods of intensified religious fervor and attempts to crack down on perceived moral laxity. The rise of lay piety movements like the Devotio Moderna emphasized personal devotion and moral rigor. The anxiety over heresy and witchcraft, which would reach terrifying peaks in the early modern period, had its roots in these later medieval centuries, and accusations of sexual deviance often played a role in such persecutions. If you were accused of witchcraft, for instance, your alleged sexual congress with demons or participation in orgiastic sabbats could be a central part of the charges. The fear of the other, the deviant, the nonconformist, remained potent. So you are living in a time of transition, a world where old certainties were beginning to fray at the edges, but new ones had not yet fully solidified. The landscape of intimacy was still largely defined by medieval norms, but subtle shifts in emphasis were occurring. The focus remained heavily on marriage as the only legitimate sphere for sexual activity, and within marriage, procreation was still paramount. But the soil was being tilled for future changes: the growing importance of towns, the rise of a self-confident merchant class, the lingering impact of demographic catastrophe, and the slow spread of new ideas were all contributing to a world that was, inch by inch, becoming different from the one that had existed for centuries. What did this mean for you, on a personal level? Perhaps it meant a slightly greater possibility, if you were fortunate in your circumstances, that your arranged marriage might also involve a degree of personal compatibility. Perhaps it meant that discussions of love and companionship, while still secondary to duty and procreation, were not entirely absent from the cultural conversation. Or perhaps, if you were on the wrong side of societal norms, it meant an even more precarious existence, as anxieties about moral decay and deviance sometimes led to harsher crackdowns. The medieval world was not fading away quietly. It was a period of intense dynamism, contradiction, and often heightened anxiety, as old structures creaked and new possibilities, both liberating and threatening, began to emerge on the horizon. The intimate lives of people were caught in this crucible of change, reflecting both the enduring power of tradition and the first stirrings of a world that would eventually come to see sex, love, and the self in profoundly different ways. The seeds of the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment were being sown, and with them, the ground was being prepared for a long, slow transformation of the sexual landscape itself. But the echoes of those medieval bedchambers, with their fears, their hopes, and their complex negotiations between divine law and human desire, would linger for a long time to come. You find yourself then in a world that is undeniably still medieval, yet pregnant with change. The grand, overarching narrative of Christendom, while still dominant, is facing internal stresses and external challenges. The Avignon papacy, the Great Schism, these events had shaken the unquestioned authority of the Church for some. And as we touched upon, the intellectual ferment of early humanism, with its renewed focus on classical antiquity, was gently nudging thought beyond purely theological frameworks. How did this shifting ground affect something as personal, yet as socially regulated, as sex and intimacy? It wasn't an overnight revolution in the bedchamber, but rather a slow, almost imperceptible alteration in the atmosphere, the available ideas, and perhaps the range of acceptable feelings. Consider the burgeoning literature of the late Middle Ages. While religious texts still predominated, secular works were gaining wider circulation, especially with the very early, nascent stages of printing towards the end of our period. Authors like Chaucer in England, Boccaccio in Italy, or Christine de Pizan in France offered perspectives on love, marriage, and human folly that were often more nuanced, more worldly, and sometimes more critical of existing norms than what had come before. You might encounter Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, with its vibrant cast of characters, including the famously outspoken Wife of Bath, who offers a surprisingly assertive, if controversial, perspective on marriage, sex, and female desire. She speaks openly of her 5 husbands, of her enjoyment of sex, and of her belief in female sovereignty within marriage. In wifehood I will use mine instrument, as freely as my Maker hath it sent, she declares. If I be dongerous, God give me soreway, min housebonde shall it hen both eve and moreway. If I am standoffish, God give me sorrow, my husband shall have it, my sexual instrument, both evening and morning. This is not the voice of demure, submissive piety. While fictional, and perhaps intended as satire, her voice resonated because it tapped into existing, if often unspoken, realities and desires. Did reading or hearing such tales embolden ordinary people to think differently about their own lives? Perhaps not overtly, but it certainly broadened the imaginative landscape. Christine de Pizan, one of the few prominent female writers of the era, offered a different but equally significant contribution. In works like the Book of the City of Ladies, she defended women against misogynistic attacks, common in literature, arguing for their virtue, their intellectual capabilities, and their importance to society. While she upheld chastity and marital fidelity, her work provided a powerful counter-narrative to centuries of portrayal of women as inherently weak, lustful, or deceitful. Imagine, as a woman in that era, encountering arguments that affirmed your worth and dignity, that challenged the notion that your sex made you inherently more prone to sin. Would it not offer a measure of intellectual and emotional fortitude? Moreover, the legal frameworks surrounding marriage and sexuality, while still largely based on canon law, were also subject to local interpretations and evolving civil codes in growing urban centers. Marriage disputes concerning validity, consummation, impotence, or annulment filled the records of ecclesiastical courts. These cases, while often focused on legal technicalities, provide fascinating, if often filtered, glimpses into the intimate lives and expectations of medieval people. You might find yourself in such a court, perhaps seeking an annulment from a marriage you claim was never consummated, or defending yourself against accusations of adultery. The process would be public, intrusive, and deeply personal. Witnesses would be called. Intimate details, often embarrassing or painful, would be laid bare. These records reveal that while the ideal of indissoluble marriage was strong, the reality was often messy, contested, and subject to negotiation and legal maneuvering. They show individuals actively trying to shape their marital destinies, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And what about those on the very fringes, those whose lives and desires explicitly transgressed the dominant norms? We've spoken of the condemnation of sodomy and other non-procreative acts, yet subcultures, however deeply hidden, likely persisted. In larger cities, with their greater anonymity compared to rural villages, it might have been slightly easier for individuals with same-sex desires to find each other, to form discrete networks. The records are scant, often only appearing in the form of denunciations or trials. But the very existence of such trials and the repeated condemnations in sermons and legal texts suggest a persistent reality that authorities were constantly trying to suppress. Imagine the courage, or perhaps the desperation, it took to seek out companionship and intimacy in a world that branded your very desires as an abomination, punishable by death. Every shared glance, every whispered word, every secret meeting would be fraught with unimaginable risk. Yet the human need for connection is a powerful force. The visual arts of the later Middle Ages also offer intriguing, if sometimes ambiguous, clues. While much religious art continued to depict scenes of temptation, sin, and divine judgment related to the flesh, there was also an increasing naturalism, a greater attention to the human form and human emotion. Portraits became more common, capturing individual likenesses. Even in religious scenes, figures might be imbued with a more recognizable humanity. And in secular art, such as illuminated manuscripts of romances or scenes of courtly life, depictions of love, courtship, and sometimes even playful intimacy became more frequent. These images, circulating among the literate and wealthy, helped to shape and reflect evolving sensibilities. They didn't necessarily signal a radical break with tradition, but they contributed to a cultural atmosphere where human emotions and experiences were being explored with increasing depth and variety. But as the medieval period drew to its close, it's crucial to remember that this was not a linear progression towards modern attitudes. The forces of change coexisted with powerful currents of conservatism and reaction. The late 15th and early 16th centuries, often seen as the dawn of the Renaissance, were also a time of intense religious anxiety, the rise of the witch hunts, and preparations for the seismic shifts of the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation, when it came, would have its own profound and complex impact on attitudes toward sex, marriage, and the family, sometimes leading to stricter moral codes in Protestant territories, even as it challenged the celibacy of the clergy and the sacramental nature of marriage as defined by the Catholic Church. You are standing on a precipice. The world your grandparents knew is beginning to transform, but the shape of the future is still unclear, contested, and in many ways fraught with new uncertainties. The very concept of privacy, as we understand it, was still in its infancy. Most people lived in close quarters, sharing beds not just with spouses, but sometimes with children or even servants. Private moments were rare and precious. Yet perhaps in the growing towns, among the merchant class with their larger, more differentiated houses, the idea of a private chamber, a space for personal reflection or intimate conversation, was beginning to take root, however slowly. This physical separation, even if limited, could subtly alter the way people experienced their own bodies and relationships. So, as the medieval sun begins to set, the landscape of intimacy is one of complex and often contradictory currents. The old rules, the old fears, the old hierarchies still cast long shadows. But new ideas, new social structures, and new forms of expression are creating openings, challenging assumptions, and laying the groundwork for a world where the relationship between the individual, their desires, and society would be renegotiated in profound and lasting ways. The story of what sex was really like in medieval times is not just about a distant, alien past. It's also about the deep historical roots of our own contemporary understandings, our own freedoms, and our own ongoing struggles with the meaning of love, desire, and human connection. And as we prepare to draw our final conclusions, we must carry these complexities forward, understanding that the end of one era is always the beginning of another, each built upon the foundations, both seen and unseen, of what came before. And so our journey through the firelit chambers and shadowed alleyways of medieval intimacy nears its end. We've peered through the keyholes of history, listened to the hushed confessions, and felt the rough-spun wool and cold stone of a world both alien and achingly familiar. You've walked alongside the peasant and the princess, the monk and the merchant, as they navigated the labyrinthine rules and profound desires that shaped their most private lives. Now, as the light of this particular exploration begins to dim, what enduring echoes do we carry forward from this complex, often contradictory past? What was sex really like in medieval times? It was, as we've discovered, not one thing, but a multitude, a kaleidoscope of sin and sacrament, duty and desire, terror and tenderness, all played out under the vast, often judgmental, sky of a thousand-year epoch. The legacy of medieval attitudes toward sex is not something neatly confined to history books. It is woven, sometimes invisibly, into the fabric of Western thought and social norms, even today. Think of the deep-seated anxieties that still surround sexuality in many cultures, the persistent tension between pleasure and procreation, or the way shame can still cling to discussions of the body. Many of these threads can be traced back to the theological and social frameworks meticulously constructed during the Middle Ages. The idea of sex as something inherently dangerous, a force to be controlled, channeled, and confined almost exclusively within the bounds of procreative marriage, cast a shadow so long that parts of it still touch us. You can almost hear the echoes of the penitentials, the stern warnings of the confessors, in the moral debates that continue to rage in our own time. The notion that some acts are natural and others unnatural. The intense scrutiny of desires that deviate from the perceived norm. These are not new anxieties. They are ancient ones, refined and amplified over centuries. As you look back now from the vantage point of your own time, you realize that those medieval bedchambers, those hushed encounters, those stark choices, were not just distant, dusty scenes. They were crucibles. Crucibles where the very definitions of love, sin, consent, and identity were being forged and contested. The long struggle for female agency, for a woman's right to control her own body and her own destiny in matters of love and childbearing. The medieval woman knew its weight intimately. She carried it in every perilous childbirth, in every forced submission, in every whispered folk remedy sought in desperation. The path towards greater autonomy has been arduous, and understanding its medieval starting points, the lack of legal standing, the economic dependence, the cultural silencing, helps us appreciate the magnitude of the journey and the distance still, perhaps, to be traveled. And what of love itself? We saw how courtly love offered an idealized, often unconsummated vision of romantic devotion, a stark contrast to the pragmatic, dynastic marriages of the nobility. We saw how ordinary folk likely found their own forms of affection and companionship amidst the daily toil. The medieval period didn't invent love, nor did it deny it, but it certainly framed it differently. The slow, hesitant shift towards acknowledging companionship and mutual affection as valuable components of marriage, which we glimpsed in the later Middle Ages, was a quiet revolution, the first tender shoots of an idea that would take centuries to fully blossom. The idea that marriage could be, and perhaps should be, founded on love and personal choice rather than solely on duty or dynastic strategy. Can you imagine the courage it took, even to think differently, when the weight of tradition and religious doctrine was so immense? This exploration was always intended to move beyond the simplistic stereotypes that often cling to the Middle Ages, the myth of unbridled barbarity on one hand, or of universal joyless piety on the other. The reality, as we've seen, was far more nuanced. It was a world where profound faith coexisted with earthy humor, where strictures bred ingenuity, and where repression could fuel an intense, if often clandestine, inner life. The bawdy fableau, the passionate mystical writings, the enduring folk traditions, all speak to the resilience of the human spirit, its refusal to be entirely contained by even the most formidable of structures. You run, you hide, you pray, but you also laugh, you love, you create. You seek connection. This, perhaps, is one of the most vital lessons. The medieval experience of sex was profoundly shaped by a lack of what we now take for granted: scientific understanding of biology, effective contraception, widespread literacy, and the concept of individual rights. Their world was one where the divine permeated every aspect of life, where the community's gaze was ever present, and where life itself was often precarious. To judge them solely by our modern standards would be to miss the richness and complexity of their own lived reality. Instead, perhaps we can ask ourselves, what does their story tell us about the enduring human condition? What does it reveal about the ways societies have always sought to regulate and understand this most fundamental aspect of our existence? The questions of power, of consent, of love, of sin, of what it means to be human in our most intimate moments. These are timeless questions. The medieval world simply offered a different and often starker set of answers. And as you stand at the threshold of that past, looking back one last time before returning to your own present, you might realize that those small choices, those private struggles, those whispered hopes and fears of individuals long turned to dust were not insignificant. They were the very currents that shaped the flow of history, leading in ways both direct and indirect to the world you inhabit now. The path from their understanding of sex to ours has been long, winding, and often fraught. Recognizing the weight of that history, the burdens carried, and the slow, hard-won changes can perhaps offer us a deeper appreciation for the freedoms we may possess, and a greater empathy for the ongoing struggles for dignity and autonomy that continue around the world. This has been a deep dive, a journey into often shadowed corners, and I am so grateful you've chosen to walk this path with me. What are your thoughts? Did any part of this story particularly resonate with you or surprise you? Is there knowledge or perspectives you'd like to share from your own understanding of this period? Please do let me know in the comments below. I truly value hearing from you and learning from our shared exploration. And of course, if you found this journey through medieval intimacy illuminating, if you appreciate these deep explorations into the hidden histories of our past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what makes these extensive narratives possible, and it's a tremendous encouragement for me to continue unearthing and sharing these stories with you from all corners of the world. Thank you for joining me tonight, for lending your curiosity and your empathy to this often misunderstood chapter of human experience. The past is never truly past. It lives on in us, in our societies, in the questions we continue to ask. May we always approach it with a desire to understand, not just the grand events, but the intimate human heart that beat within them. Until next time, may your own journeys through history be filled with discovery and wonder.